제프 클레비어가 전하는 투자자의 생각의 흐름, 진행에는 beSUCCESS 네이스 이사님께서 수고해 주시겠습니다. 큰 박수로 맞아주시길 부탁드리겠습니다. 감사합니다. Towards being poetic MCing in the future, but for now on the nipple like a hookah. Fast forward, play games and nuke a bit. The years progress, mess with cats that dip and dabbled in chess. Less strategical but meaningful. Growing was completed so fast. Third grader doing fifth grade math. Knew the library staff and half the books I read shed light. Damn those Arabian Nights was influenced by love that be of my birthright.
Well, welcome to beLAUNCH, Jeff.
Thank you so much. Hi, everyone.
Great to have you. So I wonder if you could just start off with a brief introduction of what you do in Silicon Valley, what you've built over there.
Sure. So I'm Jeff Clavier. I'm the managing partner of SoftTech VC, which is a firm based in Palo Alto in California. Started it 9 years ago, and it's one of the premier micro VC firms. So micro VCs really is something that has emerged about 6-7 years ago to really take advantage of the seed stage opportunity in terms of investments. VCs have been around for 40 years, but as companies became much cheaper to get off the ground, you know, the typical saying is that it used to take 5 to 10 million to get started in 2000. In 2010, it's essentially, you know, 250 to 500K. The ecosystem in the Valley had to adjust and create a set of firms that were really geared towards supporting those early stage companies. And SoftTech is one of them. Got to it after, so moving to the Valley, I'm French, or I was French.
Yep, I wonder if you could give a bit of background to your actual stage in,
sure.
in moving
Happy
to the
to do
Valley.
so.
Yep, yep.
So born, raised, educated in Paris, and actually have a technical background. So Master of Science in Computer Science and minor in Distributed Computing, so theory of networks. And I got in finance doing a startup that brought Unix workstations in trading floors in the late 80s. Sold that after 5 years, stayed with the acquirers for 7 years as one of their CTOs. And in 2000, moved to the Valley to become a traditional VC. Worked for 4 years in Palo Alto as a partner, and then started SoftTech in 2004.
And what was it about the Valley that really captivated you, and why did you make the move from France to the Valley? Is it something that you would encourage everyone here to do, for example?
Well, I think there's two things. One is I really wanted to leave France, and B, I really wanted to move to the Valley. So I managed to do take one trip and actually achieve both goals. So the reason why the Valley was so compelling to me is that this is really where entrepreneurship is celebrated at the highest, I think, in the world. And if you have an opportunity to spend time in the Valley, whether it's, you know, for an internship, whether it's to work for one of the large companies there, I think it's an exceptional experience that you will get. And so I would encourage everyone who has an opportunity to do so to go spend, you know, a few years over there if you can. For us, it was really sort of a one-way trip. So we landed on August 10th of 2000, and there's no plan to ever go back, ever.
Sure. So what would you encourage Korean students to do in terms of going and finding an internship? What are the specific values that they can get from working, getting experience in Silicon Valley that they could employ back in Korea?
I think it's a matter of, and whether it's, you know, early in your student career or sort of as your first job, it's just having exposure of sort of the way things are done in the Valley, and this sort of mental way we have to always try and shoot for very large opportunities which could potentially, you know, change the world. Even though if you look at the number of companies that grow really big and actually change the world, they're very few and far between. But there is a sort of aspiration and way of thinking about it that I think is great, because it just opens your mind. And certainly I didn't do that when I was, you know, 22 or 23, because essentially I was doing a startup. But I think it's really something that is interesting. Sort of trying to see the world through someone else's perspective is something that I really want my children to actually experiment.
Now, obviously, we're in the early stages of creating an ecosystem here in Korea, and people talk a lot about copying certain aspects of what's going on in Silicon Valley. What things do you think we should be looking at importing from the Valley or learning from Silicon Valley?
It's sort of tricky because the Valley is sort of a unique ecosystem that has been 40 plus years in the making. And so saying that you want to import Silicon Valley is actually really challenging because by definition you need to live through that history, hopefully accelerated, to get the different components of the ecosystem. So I think if you look at what we have out there, we have great universities which provide us with a lot of talent to get into startups or established companies. We have a lot of experience, expertise that entrepreneurs who have been successful in their previous endeavors actually are willing to contribute and support whatever comes next. And I think this notion of, we call it the paid forward, I've been helped and therefore I will help other people to achieve their goals and dreams without sort of a transactional expectation that I will get something in return, is something very unique, where I'll help you without knowing whether it will help me in the future, but that's fine because the ecosystem will get better because of this sort of one-way circle of help. And that is pretty unique. And if you can rebuild that, where people sort of start helping each other without sort of a direct expectation, very transactional expectation that they will get something in return, you'll sort of start building the basic of an ecosystem. And I think more recently, the thing that has really gotten my attention is how open people are about their successes and their failures. Because as an entrepreneur, you're going to, hit a lot of road bumps every day. And if you can get some people to sort of give you a hint, some help, some piece of knowledge that avoids, a major issue, you will get better at it.
Sure. I think you're touching there on the community aspect that Silicon Valley has, and that seems to be one of the most important things that we could perhaps copy. How do you build the community in that way?
I think it's probably the hardest because you have to start small and then eventually sort of rope people in. And like I said, it's been 40 years in the making. And yes, we also have a bunch of money available, in Silicon Valley, which helps, but it's really not the main thing. So the community aspect, I think, first and foremost, needs to inspire. And so one of the things that is very clear in the Valley and to some extent in the US is that entrepreneurs are really sort of celebrated. Sometimes a bit too much, but definitely they are the champions of the economy. They are, extremely well known. They're in the press, in the media, in the mainstream media all the time. They're on talk shows, on TV, and so on and so forth, which means that they can become sort of role models for the younger generation because they see that it's actually great to be an entrepreneur. Whereas in other countries, I don't know about Korea, but if I look at old Europe, you really have, politicians, very established businessmen, sports, and sort of music, movie celebrities, or whatever, but not enough of entrepreneurs. And so there isn't this sort of role model aspiration aspect that transpires. Then there is another sort of cultural, which I know is sort of important in Korea, which is how is potential failure perceived, and the social pressure of failure will, by definition, limit people's sort of ability to try and build something big, radical, but very risky, because if they suffer from failure, then they will not try to do what we call a moonshoot. Whereas in the US or in Silicon Valley, I think be very clear that it's really the Valley. If you go to Texas, if you go to other places in the US, it's not as open. But in the Valley, if you go for a moonshoot and it fails, well, it's fine because by definition, it was a moonshoot and therefore it was highly likely to just blow up. And people will never sort of penalize you for that.
Sure. So what can be learned from failure, and how do people think differently about failure in Silicon Valley?
I think it's...
What do you encourage your entrepreneurs, for example, to think about that?
Well, the problem is that if they fail too hard, then I lose a lot of money. So that's sort of the issue. But it's as long as you tried your hardest and you learned a lot when you failed, then it's completely okay. And we've seen entrepreneurs, lose abysmal amounts of money and then get onto the next thing and convince another set of investors that they actually will be okay this time, and they have learned from their past experience. And so failure is not, I wouldn't say it's celebrated, even though having a couple of failed projects is actually not bad at all. But it's really figuring out what you've learned and why you failed, and demonstrate that you've tried your hardest and it was actually big and ambitious. So there isn't this stigma of failure that you might see in many other sort of countries.
And how do you pick yourself up from that? What advice do you give people to move on from that and learn from it and move towards success?
So if it's an entrepreneur, I would say, well, you've created a mess for yourself and your investors. Clean it up. So take care of your employees, take care of your debt. Figure out how to just leave a clean situation, because the last thing I want is to have, be forced to sort of clean up someone else's mess. And then, once you're done, just move on. And I will typically say, go find a job at, an established company, go get a salary, because typically founders, won't be on a full salary for a couple of years. So make sure you go home and spend time with the kids and the wife and so on and so forth. So resource yourself, rejuvenate yourself, and then, in a couple of years, get back to it.
I wonder if we could move back to Korea specifically. Now,
Sure.
Again, we're in the early stages of forming the ecosystem here. If you were in charge of expediting the growth here, what kind of things would you do? So what practical steps would you take, both from an entrepreneurship perspective, but also from an investment perspective?
Mm-hmm. So, well, good news is that one of the key elements is having a conference like beSUCCESS, because it's a great platform. So congratulations for putting that together. So I think if you think about the different components of the ecosystem, what you need. So on one side, you need the different components of the money side. So you have VCs, angels, and this sort of thing in between, which we've sort of used the micro VCs to fill up. So that's the money side. You need to figure out who out there is going to be a set of mentors, people who are actually really able to help companies to go through the initial steps of build up, hiring, setup, product development, launch, and so on and so forth, and try and support and mold the entrepreneur without telling them what to do, because by definition, if you're a mentor, you're not doing the job, right? And then figure out the support ecosystem with large companies, whether it's media companies that could help with distribution, whether it's some of the Korean giants, whether it's Samsung or Hyundai or those guys who could actually give some of their resources to the companies, and then because Korea is a big market from a domestic market, but it's nothing in terms of, it's not nothing, but compared to the global opportunity, it's not sort of that interesting, is figure out how you help Korean entrepreneurs to start in Korea, but have a global opportunity in mind.
Sure. You touched on the mentorship, which is very important. Now, should we be bringing mentors from Silicon Valley, or trying to develop mentors here, and where would they come from? Because obviously the exit situation in Korea is not great. There's not any, or there's very few local heroes. Where would you expect those mentors to come from at this early stage?
Well, I think, so it's always great to aspire at bringing, the best and brightest. And so I would say, first and foremost, you try and figure out who's really willing to do the job, because when you're a mentor, it's actually a really, it's almost a full-time job. So when you already have a full-time job and you do that on top, it's actually very demanding. So I would say, I would try and figure out who are sort of the most established entrepreneurs who can really help mold the next generation without constraining them to the Korean way of doing things or the way they did it, because the issue, I've seen that with some angels in Boston, which was a very hot, sort of a hotbed of startups in the late 90s, early 2000s, and then has completely sort of lost its way. And when I talk to entrepreneurs there, they tell us that the mentors they have are people who just built their companies in, 95 or 98 or whatever, and therefore they're not used to actually developing companies the way we do it now. And that's really bad. So figuring out who are the people who can really be, who are local, who can help, figure out, who are the Korean imports, in the valley who would be actually ready to help. Because, there are two types of people in the valley. You have the people who, like us, will never go back, and you have people who will eventually go back to their motherland, whether they're, French or Korean or Chinese or Indian. And you want to mine that that opportunity to create the bridges and get the exposure that those guys have with the valley. And certainly there is a vibrant Korean sort of community. So much that sometimes you actually don't, like one of my CEOs, so I've been working with him for 5 years, and I just learned coming here he was Korean. It's James Spark from Fitbit. And so James is an awesome entrepreneur who's created an entire category with this company. And so you want to try and get these guys to come and visit, and they won't spend more than a couple of days or 3 days or whatever, but at least they can give you the exposure and show you that, as someone from Korean descent, you can actually make it happen. And then, Avi wants to bring some Israeli mentors, which is kind of interesting because Israel doesn't have a domestic market at all. They have to think global. They have to think products which will go in the US and expand. So that will be sort of an interesting, I want to see sort of the Israeli dudes and the Korean dudes, working together because it would be fun. But I think it's kind of an interesting model.
Interested in what's going on in Israel. So I wonder if you could maybe go into that a little bit. What is it that Israel is doing so right that we should maybe look at doing here?
So, the challenge with the build-up of your ecosystem is that it will be the Korean ecosystem. It can't really be a bit of Israel, a bit of Silicon Valley, a bit of everything. You guys have to sort of look at what you have as core strength and build around that. So I would just, a lot of European prime ministers have asked me, how do I build on Silicon Valley? And the answer is you don't. Because if this is what you want to do, you will fail. Figure out what sort of, universities, strength, what sort of entrepreneurial ecosystem, how you can put the money together, how you can remove friction, and bring it all together and call it your own version of the entrepreneurial ecosystem. So what Israel is doing, it's only 6 million people, but they have an amazing number of entrepreneurs who have big ideas and big aspirations, because by definition, for them, building a company for the Israeli market doesn't mean anything, because the domestic market is just too small. And so Avi yesterday was mentioning that for them translating, so they do everything in English, and translating in Hebrew is like their 20th priority, if ever they get to it, because by definition you never implement priority number 20. And so they think about global, so English first, opportunities that when they start, they will start in Israel, they will raise a bit of money in Israel, and immediately they will move to the US and intern there, and their CEOs know that if they're successful, they will move to the US. It's part of, there's no other way.
And we touched very briefly on the role of government, and obviously the Korean government is getting very excited about startups and developing that to boost the economy. They're also putting money into the ecosystem. What is your perspective on where that money should be going, and the role of VCs in utilizing that money towards the right ends?
So I'm always, in the US, when people from the government ask us what they could do, we tell them to try and remove any friction there might be in the system, whether it's in the legal or financial, kind of regulation. And then we'll tell them to just get the hell out of our way, because money is not the issue, right? There is plenty of money in the VC ecosystem. And so the last thing we need is government to start, pouring money in the wrong, startups. And so to me, it's great that the government is super supportive. The challenge is, to whom should the government give this money in order to get the maximum impact? And the answer is, well, you want two things. One is you want to make sure that you facilitate the build-up of the ecosystem. So, having conferences like this one, making sure that there's a lot of entrepreneur sort of meetups, having, sort of ways for entrepreneurs when they start to benefit from, shared offices or those kind of, so there is an infrastructure that you can pay for and that will be, facilitating, but trying to sort of figure out which companies should get money and which shouldn't is the job of professional investors. And so figuring out how you can, on one side, incentivize angels to take those risks by giving, sort of a proper tax set of tax incentives is one thing. Helping, a couple of micro VC firms to do this bridging between pure angels and VC Series A would be, I think, handy, because I think that there isn't that much of that in Korea. And then, make sure that VCs get the kind of money they deserve, because in the US, if you don't, even though you could argue that the VC community has really not done that great over the past 10 years, we start seeing a lot of firms that were not performing disappear, and only it's the survival of the fittest. Whoever produces performance will actually do well and raise the next fund. And that's basically what you need to do. So it's figuring out who are the capable managers to actually get those dollars to flow in the system.
Now, you've been to Korea twice before.
Yep, it's my third trip.
And I wonder if you could explain the differences you're seeing in the ecosystem now from when you've been here before. Any improvements that you've seen, and also things that we should be doing better, the ways that we can improve more.
Well, I think, it's the challenge is that I really don't have a continuous view. I was here last time 2.5 years ago, and time before was like 3.5 years ago. And so, to me, so I've heard a lot about a lot of incubators. So a couple of people mentioned, hey, we are doing this incubator here, incubator there, which I think is great, because by definition, incubators is this sort of mini ecosystem, that has a bit of money, some mentors, a lot of support, offices, and, can support 6 to 10 companies at a time. It's not much, but, at least it's definitely very positive. I've seen a lot more startups at this conference than I had ever seen. I was telling you yesterday that as I walked through the demo pit, it just reminded me, TechCrunch Disrupt, or other sort of very established conferences in the Valley, where you have people trying to sort of grab you and show you things and so on and so forth, which is what they should do. I told you, and I will regret that entrepreneurs were not trying to mob me, because in the Valley I can't show up anywhere without someone sort of trying to get my attention, because they know I am the money, and so they will try and get me to do something with them. And I don't regret that, not having the mob aspect in Seoul. So don't do that. But at the end of the day, that's what happens, right? Entrepreneurs at some point need to raise cash from investors, and they have to understand the rules of engagement as to how to go about that. But I definitely felt a lot of passion that I judged a couple of sessions yesterday. First one was so-so, and the second one I saw a couple of companies which were sort of interesting and tried to provide some hopefully useful feedback. Some people said I was mean, but I didn't mean to do that. So I think that there is something brewing which is really positive.
Now, you mentioned that you've obviously not been mobbed, but
and I'm happy. I said I was happy about it.
But startups obviously do need to approach VCs and pitch. What advice would you give to Korean startups to look attractive to VCs, both here and also in the Valley?
So there's a couple of things. One is, I mentioned those sort of rules of engagement, and as far as the Valley is concerned, and certainly different firms and different individuals have different ways. But as far as we're concerned, we, we'll be happy to shake your hand and to say hello. But if you want to pitch us for potential investment, trying to do it at a conference is actually almost the worst possible sort of way of doing it, because by definition, there's a lot going on. We don't have really a lot of time to engage. And so you introduce yourself, give your card, and say, I will get an introduction from someone we both know, which might be challenging for a Korean entrepreneur.
How do you make the approach in that case then?
LinkedIn. I mean, LinkedIn is your best friend, because every VC, every angel, everyone is on LinkedIn. So go check their LinkedIn profile and see who is, in between. In between us, meaning, who's that magical sort of common relationship that you can ask for an introduction to me. And the reason why you want that is you will sort of ask the person who knows you to use his credibility with me to sort of get you sort of high up in the flow of deals that we get. We get several thousand deals referred to us per year, and unfortunately we have to prioritize somehow, and so we prioritize based on who actually made the introduction. If it's one of our if it's one of our company, founding member or CEO, it will typically be prioritized pretty high, because it's someone we know really well, who knows us really well, and if they say, I am really interested in what those guys are doing, you should definitely take the meeting, I will take the meeting. I won't even sort of ask what they do, I will take the meeting. So finding that sort of strong relationship is sort of the way to get, in the priority inbox of sorts. In the Valley, we have this thing called Angel List, which is where entrepreneurs and investors can connect and so on and so forth. So Angel List is also a great resource. And then once you've gotten through that intro, and I've actually replied to you, and I say, okay, great, nice to meet you. Can you please send me your investor deck so I can review what you're doing to see whether this is something that is compatible with our investment strategy? Don't tell me, no, I want to come pitch you, because if I ask you for a document and you want to come, and meet with me, by definition, we won't have an alignment here. So if I ask for your deck, send me the freaking deck. Because what you have to understand is that every firm, and certainly in the Valley you have tens of them or hundreds of them, every firm is different. Every firm has different investment strategy, types of deals that they will invest in, areas that they will avoid. And so you don't want to waste your time and waste our time by pitching the wrong people. So there's a lot of homework to be done to figure out who are the right investors for the company you're building, because not everyone is, that's for sure.
Yep. So how do you go about choosing the right investor? Obviously for startups who are bootstrapping, they need money now. How do you go about choosing the right investor?
So especially with the emergence of incubators and accelerators, a lot of companies will be able to sort of get in, build the first version of their product, and start doing some market tests, validation of user acquisition, give us a sense of the initial sort of usage patterns and retention. So the very basic data that we'll ask to sort of figure out whether there's something here or not. And we expect that to be done on a bootstrap basis. If you have gone to an incubator, they might have given you 25 grand or 50 grand. So that's it. And then basically you will look at the investments that investors have backed. So, if you go to our website, softtechvc.com, you will see all the companies that have been publicly, sort of announced. We still have a bunch that haven't been yet, but roughly you will see 100 companies out there, and you can get a pretty good sense of what we do. And we have this thing called investment strategy that gives you a sense of what we invest in. So go and read the websites of the most, the who's who or the typical sort of investors. And, we always on TechCrunch and I assume that there is the equivalent here in Korea, which tells you who has invested in what. I'm not sure whether there is an equivalent of Crunchbase, but Crunchbase basically is a giant database of startups and who has invested in them.
Yeah.
So you go scour all those public resources to figure out who has invested in what, and what you need to find is companies that sort of look like you but are not competitive with you, because by definition, if I've backed one of your competitors, there's no need to send me your deck, because by definition I won't invest in you, and it would actually be a mistake to send me your investment deck if ever I was in your competitor. So you do a lot of homework and figure out the landscape of potential investors, and then you figure out who is going to be the common sort of intro, this sort of relationship we share will be putting you in front of me.
Now, going back to the startups that you've seen over the last couple of days, were there any things that you were particularly interested in terms of the technology or the types of businesses that you saw?
Nothing per se. There was, there were a couple of companies which were sort of really leveraging some specific sort of like this company which was trying to be a meta search engine or price comparison engine for groceries. And in the US that wouldn't really work because there isn't yet the sort of massive infrastructure to distribute groceries at scale. And so we have a few startups, but nothing has gone big. And so that wouldn't work over there. But over here, I hear that it's actually already scaled, and therefore it makes sense to have this kind of startup. So nothing sort of, I thought Shaker, sort of winner of your competition, was actually very slick. Actually, thanks to you, I met with David Lee, the CEO. It was challenging because there was 3 David Lees at this conference. And I thought what he was doing was interesting, and what I wanted to understand is how much of Shaker was Korean specific in terms of the way things are done versus, could we take Shaker and just, get it in the US? And I actually have an investment which is sort of the same as Shaker, but with sort of more automated, and I'm going to try and figure out whether it makes sense for David and my CEO to meet. So nothing sort of got me excited about, I need to follow up with this company. But that wasn't my goal. My goal was to really sort of understand what's going on. And I take a trip to Asia once a year just to see, how high-speed mobile broadband, strong mobile-first culture, sort of delivers in terms of services, and there's anything that I need to bring back to the US in terms of knowledge more than anything.
Sure. Now, what advice would you give? We obviously, this is a special VC session. There's many Korean VCs here. What advice would you give them in terms of building the ecosystem from that side to progress the Korean ecosystem?
I think it's always sort of challenging because by definition, when you've raised money as a VC, you've done it on the basis of a given strategy. And unfortunately, if you have holes in the ecosystem, and my understanding is that, you have a few angels, you have a bunch of VCs, but there's this thing in the middle that is missing, which, firms like mine or David's, so SV Angel, have done. We basically plugged that gap, and it's not that traditional VCs were not doing seed, we're just much better at doing seed than they are. And so someone's going to have to step up and figure out, okay, I understand that there is a need there, and I'm going to fill it up, because look at it as there's a massive opportunity to make a lot of money as a VC if you go and back the right companies.
And why have you chosen specifically to work in that space? I guess, how would you encourage Korean VCs to move into that space and fill that gap?
So, back in 2004, when I saw the emergence of this new category of startups which were very capital efficient, and no one was willing to give them any money. I thought it was sort of foolish because I sort of had this vision that those were the companies that would matter tomorrow, that would emerge. And so I sort of I made the decision to leave my firm and start, SoftTech. And for the first 3 years, I essentially just did angel investments. So I was investing my own money as an angel investor. And because I was sort of lucky to get into the right companies, I was actually very successful and made quite a bit of money doing that. But I mean, the making money part isn't the objective. The backing great entrepreneurs and building great companies is definitely what we're pursuing. And I was an angel investor, and then some people in the press called us the super angel, so I became a super angel. And then I created one of the first super angel funds, which essentially took our strategy as angel investors, but scaled it with other people's money. And I think that if you look at the Korean ecosystem, there's one of two ways of doing that. One is having the successful angel investors to raise, a $10, $15, $30 million fund and take hold of that seed opportunity. Or what we've seen in the Valley, some traditional VCs have left their firms to start their own to address the seed ecosystem. And if you look at the kinds of deals we do, the valuations at which we invest, and the kinds of returns we have, it's very, very compelling.
Okay. Well, I think we've just about come up to time. If you have any final comments, and certainly there's a Q&A session after David Lee's session as well. So encourage everyone here to prepare questions for Jeff.
Yeah, I hope we'll have a good conversation. So I think, I'm pretty encouraged by what I've heard over the past couple of days in terms of, the startups who really want to build something sort of interesting. The challenge for Korean entrepreneurs is not to think Korean first, is to think global and test in Korea. And it's really a major difference in terms of mindset, because if you want to build a global platform, you just create Vinod Khosla, who's one of the most famous VCs in the Valley, says that you create a $0 billion company. So a $0 billion company is something which is meant to scale and has big vision and bold sort of statements, but start somewhere. And testing things in Korea is completely fine. This is your domestic market. This is where you start. But the same way, Israeli entrepreneurs know that the next turn is basically take off and go for New York or San Francisco, whatever. This is something which Korean entrepreneurs will have to adopt as well. But I look forward to seeing the progress in 2-3 years when I come back.
Great, or maybe earlier. Okay, thank you very much, Jeff.
Thank you.